Hi, and welcome back to the Land Use Lowdown. I'm Liz Somerstein, joined by Matt Scott, and we are partners in the Greenspoon Marder land use team. So today's topic of the podcast has been generating a lot of calls that we've received into our office, and that is the newly passed Infill Redevelopment Act.
This one sort of went under the radar during the legislative session, which was surprising because it's a really significant piece of legislation. It sits alongside the Live Local Act as part of a broader trend of the state preempting local land use authority in the name of trying to spur an increase in the housing supply. This one is narrower and in some respects more aggressive in how it limits local discretion.
So we're going to walk through what this act does, who qualifies, and then also spend a little bit of time on where we expect some of the friction to be with this new legislation, both for developers and for the local governments that now have to administer it. So the legislative findings frame it this way. South Florida's urban areas don't have enough land left to meet housing demand, and a meaningful amount of that land sits idle because it's either environmentally impacted either with contamination or has some sort of brownfield designation. So when you combine that with local zoning, that makes redevelopment slow and uncertain for this property. The legislature's response was similar to what they did with Live Local. So they basically required that if you meet the conditions under this new act, the local government must permit residential development on the property through an administrative process. So no public hearings are required.
And that's a really big part worth sitting with here and explaining. Under the normal process, the traditional process, if you wanted to redevelop certain sites that aren't zoned for residential development, it would require a rezoning or a land use plan amendment or a special exception, particularly in Broward, Miami-Dade, or Palm Beach County. And that would involve staff review, a public hearing in front of a planning and zoning board that would provide a recommendation, and then typically an elected official city commission vote. These can usually take months, if not years in most cases, and carries real political risk along the way. Now, this fits the pattern we see with the Live Local Act in 2023. The state is narrowing situations in which local governments can exercise discretion over housing approvals. So they're taking away from the cities the right to dictate and control redevelopment in certain areas.
That's right. And so now I kind of want to switch gears to talk about what qualifies you to use this act because the terms of it are written pretty narrowly. So Matt, can you walk us through the criteria?
Yes. So the law is very precise. It only targets certain types of properties. There are 4 requirements to qualify. The parcel must satisfy every single one of them. So first, the site must be at least 5 acres. So it's not going to apply to any sort of small sites. Second, the site must be environmentally impacted. And what this means is either a phase 2 site assessment found contaminants above residential cleanup levels, or the site carries a brownfield designation under section 376.80 of the Florida statutes. Third, the parcel must be adjacent to a parcel already zoned for residential use as of right. And fourth, it must be in a county with a population over 1.475 million people and have at least 15 municipalities.
And that location bit of it is really important. And just to keep in mind, so as of today, for our listeners, that does include all 3 South Florida, the main South Florida counties. So Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach.
And what's interesting about these requirements is when you put the pieces together, while golf courses don't seem to be specifically mentioned in the act, golf courses, for the most part, would fit all of these requirements because they're pretty much always over 5 acres. And they, to my knowledge, are pretty much always environmentally contaminated. So there are exclusions, however, for sites that would not qualify. Designated agricultural land wouldn't qualify. Land owned by a local government for park purposes also doesn't qualify. Anything within a quarter mile of a military installation is excluded. And land owned by a public utility at any point in the last 15 years is excluded from these advanced rights of the act.
So Matt, I know you just talked about golf courses a little bit, but I do think that that is one of the most impactful parts of this bill and how it relates to golf course redevelopment. And that's what we're seeing a lot with our developer clients. So I'm going to talk about the impact on golf courses just a minute. So again, it's not specifically written for golf courses, but typically does seem to apply to golf courses because most golf courses, at least the ones that were down here, many of them were built between, the 60s and the 80s and are all likely contaminated with some level of arsenic or other contaminants just based off of the pesticides and other chemicals used to maintain the golf course. And all of them are well over 5 acres. I think an average 18-hole golf course is probably around 150 to 200 acres. So it really does give a good base to redevelop some of these golf course assets that have been sitting undeveloped for a substantial amount of time down here in the South Florida area.
Yeah, going back to when Tiger Woods first burst on the scene, there was an explosion of golf and lots of new golf courses built. And so there are many golf courses in South Florida, but not all of them are doing great. There's many that are financially struggling. And so this new law is going to make it much easier to redevelop those struggling golf courses. There's a separate additional set of requirements, though, when the qualifying parcel includes one of these recreational facilities, like a golf course, and is surrounded by single-family homes on all sides. Three additional requirements apply in that scenario. First, the developer must establish that the facility hasn't been in operation for at least 12 months. So a course simply can't close and have an application filed the following week. Second, the developer in that scenario where there is single-family homes on all sides of the golf course, or the property for that matter, would have to pay double the standard parks and recreation impact fees to compensate for the loss of open space. The idea here is that even if the golf course is not doing well, or even if the open space feature, Frisbee golf, let's say hypothetically, is not doing well, it did operate as an open space feature for the surrounding community. And so the legislature put this in there to compensate for that loss. The developer has to pay double the park impact fees. And then third, the developer must send certified mail notice to every adjacent property owner. That notice must disclose the intent to develop and give those owners a 90-day option to purchase the parcel themselves to preserve it as open space. So what we see sometimes with golf courses surrounded by single-family homes, there's a lot of noise surrounding, well, why don't we put some money together and buy it to keep it that way to prevent a developer from developing on it. And so the law specifically provides that mechanism and actually requires it.
And it actually goes a step further than that too, and limits or clarifies what price they have to offer the land to the adjacent homeowners. So the act provides that when the developer sends this notice out to the homeowners to let them know that they have the option to purchase it, the purchase price can either be the greater of what the property owner paid plus 10%, or the amount of any bona fide offer that the owner received within the last 12 months. So the neighboring owners have a path to acquire the land, but it's limited because if this 90-day window passes and they don't exercise that option, they lose the right to purchase the property. I want to talk also about what you get under this act. So we've already established that it's similar to Live Local, and if you meet the criteria, which Matt went over what the criteria are, then you get to do residential development and it's administratively approved. But the act also details what you can do in terms of your density and intensity for that residential development. So with respect to density, the density is capped at either the average density of the adjacent residential zoning districts that are surrounding your property, or 25 units an acre, so whichever is lower. So the Infill Redevelopment Act does not give you an unlimited, uncapped amount of density. It's really trying to keep the density consistent with the surrounding community, but make it easier to develop the property and provide affordable housing or housing in the community.
The act also speaks to the intensity of development. And what we mean by that is height and floor area. So you must comply with the standards applicable to an adjacent parcel. There's an interesting gap worth flagging here. The statute doesn't address what happens when adjacent parcels have differing intensity standards. So we think that ambiguity will likely be resolved parcel by parcel through interpretation by local zoning and building officials, and perhaps maybe through some litigation or an amendment to the act before it settles. It's just not crystal clear in the law what the height and floor area limitations would be for one of these sites that someone's looking to redevelop. And where the qualifying parcel is adjacent to single-family homes or townhouses on all sides, the act does require a minimum 20-foot buffer measured lot line to lot line. And that has to be maintained as open space or improved with passive recreational use. And so swales and water retention areas would count towards that buffer. Next thing we want to talk about is the large benefits of this new law, why so many of our developer clients are interested in this. The upside clearly, first would be that there's administrative approval. There's no commission hearing, no discretionary rezoning or land use plan amendment. That, of course, is going to save a lot of time and eliminate the political risk.
Another advantage is that it opens up land that was effectively dead capital for the owner. So a contaminated 5-acre site or a closed golf course was, in many cases, simply sitting there as a liability. And now there is a defined legal pathway to bring it to market and in a way that brings a community benefit with providing housing.
Third, it provides certainty on density and intensity early in the process before significant entitlement costs are incurred. That allows for more reliable underwriting compared to guessing at what a commission might ultimately approve. What we see in our practice working on golf course redevelopment as an example is that a developer will get a old closed golf course under contract and have this long contractual time frame to get it entitled, to get the land use plan amendment or rezoning approved. Well, during that process, there is uncertainty and risk about how much they're going to be able to build, what the city is going to allow, that makes it really challenging to work on and develop those sorts of deals. This law is going to help drastically reduce that.
Fourth, another advantage of this is that the preemption language is expressed. So effectively what the legislature has done with this legislation is rezoned the property to permit residential development, which adds a layer of certainty when you're trying to finance and develop these projects.
Now, I think it's important that we also talk about the disadvantages and concerns with the new law. So we want to talk about where these things get a little more complicated. The Act does not waive environmental cleanup obligations. Developers remain subject to Department of environmental protection requirements. And in Miami-Dade and Broward, the county level corrective action environmental assessment ordinances continue to apply as well. So environmentally impacted status gets you these entitlement rights. It gets you this effective automatic rezoning under the Act, but it doesn't relieve remediation liability. If housing is built on a former contaminated site and an issue was missed, that exposure remains for the developer and for whoever insured the deal.
There's also a political component of this as well. Administrative approval on paper doesn't guarantee a frictionless process in practice, especially with new legislation like this, where we're all still interpreting it in real time. So developers should anticipate some scrutiny and plan for community engagement and feedback, even though the formal hearing isn't a legal requirement.
And the intensity ambiguity we mentioned earlier is a real open question, where adjacent parcels carry inconsistent height or floor area standards. That issue hasn't been resolved yet, and there are likely to be growing pains with the interpretation and implementation of the Act. At least in its current iteration, which contains certain vague implementation guidelines. As a comparison, what we saw with the Live Local Act was it came out, everyone was really excited about it, and then all the cities tried to figure out ways to make it difficult or block it. And so the legislature had to come back and amend it now, and I think they amended it twice. It is fair to assume that cities are going to respond similarly to this law.
That's right. And so for anyone listening who thinks that they have a qualifying site, we would all recommend that you start kind of going through your checklist. Is it 5 acres? Is it environmentally impacted? Are you adjacent to residential zoning? And are you in the right county or municipality that is of the qualifying size? And as long as you have all of those, you're ready to start the process of evaluating a project under the new act.
And if there's any history of recreational use on the site, document the dormancy period as early as possible. So if you own a golf course, as an example, and you're surrounded by single family homes and you want to position it for redevelopment, we would suggest closing as soon as possible.
So this act, it's a substantial shift for residential infill development, and certainly in Miami, Broward, and Palm Beach. The benefits, they're not unconditional, but for developers who can work through these qualifying criteria, it really is one of the more direct pathways that Florida has created for housing on this difficult to develop land. And this is consistent with the broader pattern that we've seen out of Tallahassee with preemption. This tends to come first, and we're kind of anticipating that litigation regarding this act may follow. But we are continuing to track the early challenges as projects move forward and as everybody works through the implementation of the act.
If you're evaluating a potential site and want to confirm whether it qualifies, reach out to our offices. This is a significant part of what we're working on right now.
And that's it for today. We appreciate everybody listening, and we will be back with another topic relevant to South Florida development.